Okay, well, this is our class on the canon, the biblical canon, and we are in our time period of the Old Testament. And so this is our conclusions from our last lecture last week, which I think is available online. The closing of the Old Testament canon is murky. My job would be a whole lot easier. We wouldn't really have this class if the biblical books had a little halo around them, or if it was, signed by God. Now, I think that they are, but how we get there is a little bit complicated and will take us a while. The contents of the Old Testament canon are contested. So we've talked a lot already about the Apocrypha. Okay, so the Old Testament itself is different if you have a Catholic Bible or if you have a Protestant Bible. Why is that? Because church councils made some decisions to include some books that Protestants do not think should be in there. And as researchers dig deeper into the record, we find evidence for what Protestants have alleged all along, that neither canon was created by a council. I say neither canon. We think of it as a canon entire, but neither the Old Testament canon nor the New Testament canon were created by a council. Wasn't the Council of Trent for the New Testament, wasn't the Council of Jamnia for the Old. And that neither canon left authoritative works out. There are some other good, helpful, works of antiquity, so works from this time period, that talk about God, talk about the people of God, talk about things of God, but are not authoritative canon. And you can be confident that they were left out for a good reason. So the lecture this morning, I think, is going to be relatively short. One of the reasons for that is just raise your hand if you need if you want the printout for this week's lectures. Pastor Barker will give it to you. I started working on this, and my computer melted down or just stopped working, and so I had to redo this while I was at Ridgehaven this week on my phone. So for your benefit, it'll be brief. Okay, but what we're doing here is we're going over all of the different documents, the witnesses to the canon. We're not going to get into precisely what they say about the Old Testament canon. I'd love to, but it took me all this time just to go over the witnesses themselves. But I want you to know what we're talking about when I say Talmud, when I say Midrash, when I say Mishnah. And so that's what we're going to be going over today. We'll reference these things later on in our course. And if you get the impression that it seems like Nick is figuring this out as he goes along, that's partly accurate, because I'm having a hard time reading through, having finished all this before the class. But here we are. So, ancient literature that frames a discussion about the canon, what should be in the canon. We have, one of the things that we have is the Samaritan Pentateuch. Samaritan meaning Northern Kingdom of Israel. It split off. And so the Pentateuch is the first 5 books of the Bible. And so we have that. We have historical record of that relatively early, 2nd century BC. Now, I mentioned the date here, and you're going to see quite a few dates here. And one of the things that we're referring to is, remember the hypothesis from last week's lecture, is that the Old Testament canon was basically finalized or really canonized at the Council of Jamnia in AD 90, and probably had some Christian influence. And what I'm going to try to show you is that we have records, historical records, from well before that time, 2nd century BC, that kind of paint a different story. Okay? So at least the Pentateuch. Pentateuch is easy, it's a gimme, of course, please. It was cemented before the Christian era. Okay? And we have it in its Samaritan form and record of it in the 2nd century BC. We also have the Apocrypha before the Christian era. Okay? And though the Wisdom of Solomon, 1st and 2nd Maccabees, this is me typing on my phone, sorry, were composed in Greek, the others come to us through non-Hebrew translations, yet even they are early. So some of it is coming through in Greek. Some of it that we have in Greek looks like it's been translated from the Hebrew. So these are the Apocrypha books. And so the Apocrypha, though I'm not saying we should have it in our canon, is an early testator to the canon that we have. It's going to speak to and interpret and shine a light on the Old Testament that we have is authoritative. And it is 1st and 2nd century BC. Ecclesiasticus we have dated from 132 BC, which has things to say. This is a book in the Apocrypha, but it has things to say about the Old Testament canon that we have. Tobit, another Apocrypha book, appears to be older than the Ecclesiasticus because of its Persian influences. So we can date things based upon what overarching empire was influencing it. Judith another book of the Apocrypha, seems to come from before mid-2nd century BC. And we can tell that because of hand-washing practices that it recommends among the Pharisees. These changed over time, and we have other historical indicators of when they were. So we find Ecclesiasticus, Tobit, Solomon, Maccabees, all early, 1st and 2nd centuries BC. Now, I'm not saying, because they're early, we should include them. I'm not saying that. But I'm saying they're pre-Christian. They're pre-Christian, and so they're going to give us, in some ways, unbiased opinion about what should be in the Old Testament canon. First Maccabees dates from 100 BC. Second and third Maccabees seem not much later. First Esdras is considered a paraphrastic Greek translation of Ezra and Nehemiah, and so it's old. So what that tells you, so Esdras is an apocryphal book. I'm not arguing that it should be in the canon. But what it's doing very early on is translating Ezra and Nehemiah. What does that tell us? Ezra and Nehemiah are important. Ezra and Nehemiah are so important that even in the 1st and 2nd centuries, it needs to be translated into Greek. That tells you that it's out there, it's being spread. Lots of people want to read this. And so even this apocryphal book, First Esdras, is in a roundabout way a proof for the canonicity, the legitimacy, the importance of Ezra and Nehemiah, which are some of the later books, and they're kind of contested. Are they really canonical? Yes. There are additions to Esther, which we see exists from 78 to 77 BC. Again, not saying these should be included, but they're going to provide for us some indications of what should be in the canon itself. And so, if you have additions to Esther, okay, if you have additions to Esther as early as 78 and 77 BC, what does that tell you? Of necessity, we have Esther then. Esther is not a Christian creation. Okay? So, the allegation that there was a Christian influence and that, the Old Testament is just a Christian interpolation, assumption of what should be authoritative, and they handpicked what should and shouldn't be in there. It doesn't hold up. Doesn't hold up to the historical record. And Ecclesiasticus, mentioned over here, gives us the earliest tripartite structure of reckoning for the Old Testament. That's the Pentateuch, the prophets, and then, I can't remember the name of it, but it's basically the other. The writings. What is that called? Holy writings. Anyway, I can't remember the Greek name for it, but yeah. So, what does that tell you? Ecclesiasticus, 132 BC, already gives the split up of the whole Old Testament canon. It's not just the Pentateuch. It's not the Pentateuch and the prophets. It's all of it. all that we have. Now, what exactly it means in there, we'll have to get into. But it's interesting that so early, we already have, this is what the Old Testament is. It's these three groupings of holy works. Okay, now, so that was dealing a lot with the Apocrypha. And this continues to deal with it. But an appropriate name for a lot of the Apocrypha is the pseudepigrapha. What does that word mean? Pseudo means false, epigraph, writing, okay? False writing, or writing under a false name, pseudonymous. Half of the Apocrypha is pseudepigraphal. Second Esdras, sorry I misspelled that, Tobit, Wisdom of Solomon, Baruch, Jeremy, Prayer of Manasseh, Esther, and the Daniel editions are all claiming to be, oh, Daniel wrote this about Bel and the dragon. Oh, Esther wrote this. Baruch wrote this. When it shows from the way that they're writing that it actually wasn't that historical character. That this is a new gloss, a new interpretation. I think you remember what I pejoratively called it last time, which is fan fiction. Okay? It's commentary. It's holy commentary and thought. I say holy because the subject matter is holy, not that the comments themselves are divine. So I just say that just to remind you, this is another reason why we don't include a lot of the Apocrypha in our understanding of the canon, is because it's written under a false name. Why in the world would we include things written under a false name in the Scripture? That's prima facie, at its face, false. So we're not going to do that. The letter of Aristeas is one of the pseudepigraphal documents. These are documents that people think, oh, well, why doesn't the Old Testament canon include this? Okay, here's one of the reasons. It's written between 145 and 125 BC, and it includes a lot of vaticinia post eventum. Does anybody know what that means? Yeah, it means events or things after the event. So it's saying this will happen, but it's saying it ex post facto, after the fact. So it's pretending to be prophetical when really it's just historical. Again, we're not going to include that in the canon when they're kind of making up stuff. Now, interestingly enough, this is what the critics accuse Daniel and Isaiah of doing. Talking about the Alexandrine imperium after the fact. Now, I don't agree. Pseudepigrapha. This august name, so it sounds like, oh, pseudepigrapha, that sounds close to Scripture. Nope. This august name seems to be a definite design to recommend the ethical instructions by claiming for it quasi-prophetic and quasi-canonical status. In other words, the reason why we have a lot of these pseudepigraphal books is because, why did they write under somebody else's name? It's because they really wanted you to listen to them. I've got something great to say, so I'm going to say that Dave Barker said it. Then maybe you'll really listen to it. And so they did that with their theological and church historical heroes. So are you starting to see why we're not going to include some of these things in the canon? And yet, they help us and help us understand if we have interpretations, translations of Ezra, of additions to Esther, what that much before the Christian period, that tells us that they're extant, that they're going on, that they're being publicized. Another book that's trending is Ethiopic Enoch. We'll talk about Enoch a lot. And it dates from 164 to 100 BC. Remember, Tom was telling us last week that Enoch and Jubilees were included in the King James Bible, kind of in the appendix, which is one of the reasons why a lot of people are like, it's good enough to include in the appendix. It's Bible. It sounds Bible-y. Let's put it in there. It's early, and Jubilees heavily influenced the Qumran community, which is the Essenes, where we get the Dead Sea Scrolls. And so it's similarly dated. So Jubilees and Enoch, both before the Christian era. And the Assumption of Moses, this is another pseudepigraphal book. It's part of the pseudepigrapha. And it dates to around 0 AD. Again, before Jesus. And this is a picture of the cave area where a shepherd boy threw a stone into a cave. You know, boys, they're just going to throw stones. And he throws a stone into this cave, and he hears a, ooh, I broke something. What did I break? So he goes in there to find out what he broke. He broke a pottery vessel, which inside contained what we now call the Dead Sea Scrolls. And there's lots of these potteries. And Dead Sea Scrolls, they quote from the Old Testament with formulas denoting the authority of those books like Philo and the New Testament do. What do I mean formula? What's a formula? A formula is, thus saith the Lord, according to the Scripture, according to the writings, according to the book, okay, as it is written. And it could just really be generic, like, oh, somebody wrote it at some point. No. When they say, thus says the Scripture, or as it is written, what they're doing there, and what shows, they do that to the rest of the Old Testament as they do to the Pentateuch, which they definitely consider to be canonical. And Philo and the New Testament also do this when they're referring to something that they believe is canon, that they believe is Holy Writ. So we have the Dead Sea Scrolls, which date before the Christian era, referring to Old Testament passages as authoritative, as inspired. We also have Hellenistic fragments. So these are Greek fragments of documents, so not a whole document in and of itself, not something we say, oh, this is the book of, and we have the whole thing to look at. We have fragments of these things in Greek, dating to around 160 BC, and so lots of different types, but a lot of times they are philosophical exegesis of the Pentateuch. So it's Greek. So you got philosophy in there. And what are they doing? They are putting like, this is how I as a Greek understand this law of the Pentateuch to be. So what? Who cares? What this tells us again is that you have the Pentateuch as not just a great work of literature, but regarded as holy, regarded as something to be interpreted, to put your gloss on. Other Hellenistic fragments that we have, Aristeas and Eupolemus, interpret Old Testament story with imagination. So we're not arguing that these things should be included in the canon, but their existence tells us that you've got Old Testament canon, that it is widely circulated, that even Greeks want to interpret it. It's not an ironclad argument in and of itself, but it's starting to develop an idea that the Old Testament canon is pre-Christian and has been regarded as distinct for a long time. You have also this author Ezekiel, not the biblical prophet, and get this, he uses biblical themes for the composition of Greek tragedies. And this all serves to show that the Old Testament is in wide circulation and use before the Christian era. Yeah, Dan?
On the Dead Sea Scrolls, did the Dead Sea Scrolls include apocryphal books?
Yes.
And if so, is the way they reference them different between the two?
I want to know the answer to that question myself. And I think we're going to get there. But it's contested. Some people believe just because they had them, just because they stored them, they believe that they were canon. But Beckwith is saying that's a fallacy. Just because somebody kept a book doesn't mean they think it's holy. I mean, if we look at your library, does that tell us everything that's in there you agree with? Not even necessarily. So that's the same thing with them. Now, how do they specifically refer to them? I haven't studied the Dead Sea Scrolls myself enough to know the answer to that question, but I want to know too. Dave, do you know?
If there was any distinction between them? Or just...
In the Dead Sea Scrolls, they've got both apocryphal and they've got canonical works. Do they refer themselves, the Essenes refer to them with the same verbiage or different verbiage?
Yeah, I know of nothing like that.
Yeah, I don't know. Okay, so again, before the Christian era, we have Bible translation. When I say Bible, don't think New Testament and Old Testament, just think Old Testament, okay? And in this case, don't think all of the Old Testament, just think the Pentateuch. Pentateuch, remember, first 5 books of the Bible. Septuagint being the Greek translation of this. So the Greek translation of the Pentateuch was translated around 260 BC. So it's pretty early, but it's just the Pentateuch, okay? And it was done under Ptolemy Philadelphus in Alexandria. And this information is revealed to us by Aristobulus and Aristeas, whose works are extant, 2nd century. We have their works, or fragments of them. And Aristeas and Josephus assert that it was viewed, the Pentateuch was viewed as unalterable as early as the 2nd century BC, and by the 1st century AD, it was viewed as inspired over and against amenders. So people were trying to amend it, and the clapback was, no, don't touch that. That's divine. Now, we're just talking about the first 5 books of the Bible. So this should be easily established, but I'm just walking you through the historical record of all that we have. Because in some ways, it's thin. But in other ways, I want you to see it's there. We have record of this. That it's viewed as unalterable by the 2nd century BC, and you're going to see a distinction between unalterable and some of the other Jewish texts. And in the prologue to Ecclesiasticus, so Ecclesiasticus, that apocryphal book, I think I already said this, refers to all 3 sections of the Hebrew Bible in his prologue in the late 2nd century BC. So by the 2nd century, we have this record already. And then there are revisions of the Septuagint Pentateuch by Aquila and Symmachus in the 2nd century. What does that prove? Again, that proves early canonicity. This book is so important, so authoritative, that we can't alter it, and we need to do further translations of it. We need to make sure that we're getting it accurate in the Greek before Jesus. Okay, this all lends us to thinking, man, they really thought that this was holy. And throughout the scriptures themselves, we see this again. The writings, thus saith the Lord. These are also other translations. We have the Aramaic Targum. So Targum is something I'm going to be referencing. And this is just a translation of the Old Testament, of the entire Old Testament, in Aramaic. And I think we have it around the 2nd century. Okay, yeah, they're both from the 2nd century AD. So the Targum refers to Aramaic translation of the Old Testament. The Peshitta refers to the Syriac translation of the Old Testament. And both Peshitta and Targum are dating from the 2nd century AD. Again, just reminding you, we're developing the idea that the Old Testament canon was not crafted at Jamnia, but was revealed to be wholly authoritative, unalterable, at least by the 2nd century AD, the whole thing. And we've gone over this a little bit before, but here we have Philo again. He lived from 20 BC to 40 AD, so right around the same time as Jesus. And most of his writings are extended philosophical commentaries on the Pentateuch. We saw that a little bit already with the Hellenistic fragments. Philo, we have good copies of his works. And what are they? They're commentaries on the Pentateuch. What's that telling us? It's telling us this should have commentary on it. This is authoritative. This is holy. Everybody wants to put in their 2 cents on this. And he quotes from other parts of the Old Testament using consistent formulas that reveal he also views them with the same reverence. Okay? We know he views the Pentateuch as canon, and then we have record in the rest of his writings of him using the same phraseology, the same formula to talk about 1 Kings, to talk about 1 Samuel, to talk about Proverbs. He views it all as divinely inspired before Christians are on the scene, really. I mean, obviously, totally. And he provides a clear view of biblical inspiration and many general titles of the works that are in the Old Testament canon and evidence on the structure of the canon. So we're going to come back to Philo as a good witness to the canon, but I just want to introduce you to him now. You know when he's writing, kind of what he's doing, and how he's referring to the Scripture. Then we have Josephus, which we've, again, already talked about. He's a Palestinian Pharisee of priestly descent. And the complete contents of the Jewish canon can be inferred from his various statements. And he wrote in the 1st century. So we're going to use what he says a lot more and appreciate it. He's Jewish. And so we there's a little bit of a critical distance from the Christians. So if you really don't mistrust, we can't believe anything Christians say. Okay, fine. Look at what this Jew says. This will say the same things. That the Old Testament that we have in our scriptures is canon. Now, okay, so he's going to be helpful. 1st century Christian literature, besides the New Testament, does not provide much information for us. And so what is that? What am I talking about? 1 Clement, and we're not even exactly sure that the Didache was from the 1st century, but even if it was, it's still not helping us on this very much. And then also the early church fathers, the Greek church fathers, are so distant. They're 2nd and 3rd centuries, and they're not really looking at a lot of the original Hebrew, definitely not looking at the original Hebrew. So we're not going to look to them, though we normally would for a lot of Christian things. We'd look to the earliest Christian sources, 1 Clement and the early church fathers, but they actually don't help us very much in determining this question because they're more distant. And you're like, they're biased. Well, okay. So we are going to look at and find helpful rabbinical literature, other Jewish literature. What is that? Well, let me just pause there. Any comments or questions up to this point? Yeah, Dan.
You referenced the Septuagint Pentateuch. What about the rest of the Septuagint translated the whole?
The whole Septuagint. I'm not sure when we have a historically accurate version of that. I mean, like 2nd century AD. Okay? So that's significantly after Jamnia, after the Christian period. So it's good, but it's not going to be as authoritative for us on this question of what was considered canon before Christ. The Septuagint probably existed. Do we have a copy of it from before that time? No. We have it pretty early, but that's why we have to go to these other documents to frame the discussion. We're missing that literature. We don't have that. It's also, and we might find it at some point. We also have the fire of the libraries in Alexandria. That also makes this a tougher mystery and hunt to go through. So there's this book, or kind of lots of books, called the Mishnah. The Mishnah was compiled in AD 220 as a systematic codification of the oral Torah, which is a commentary on the Pentateuch. So if you talk to a pretty serious Jew today, they'll tell you, there's lots of stuff that wasn't written down in the Old Testament. It was handed down orally from the time of Moses. It's Moses' law. He just didn't write it down. It's oral, so we call it the Mishnah. And you say, oh, that sounds serious. Oh, that sounds holy. Well, here's Beckwith on this. Scholar Epstein, not of fame these days, scholarly Epstein, has shown a critical text of the Mishnah. What's a critical text? A critical text is like we have of our Hebrew Old Testament or of our Greek New Testament, which shows all of the different iterations, all the different changes that we have in the, what do you call it? The bottom half of the page. Oh, there was an omicron here where there's an omega up here. Oh, they added two theu here. Some manuscripts have it here, they don't have it here. So that's a critical manuscript where it tells us all the differences and all the different historical documents that we have. Sometimes really smart pastors are working off of their critical New Testament. We have to work on it in seminary to show capability in it. But could you have a critical text of the Mishnah? Okay, it's another holy book. It's like the Old Testament. It's like the New Testament. Okay, give me the critical edition of the Mishnah, the authoritative edition that includes all the different instances, iterations of it. Well, it's practically impossible, since the text was so fluid from the outset that it is hardly a single work. Not only were the sources which Rabbi Judah began varied and inconsistent, but the earliest Amoraim did not hesitate to revise the transmitted text of the Mishnah according to their own conceptions, working in creative partnership with the original framer or framers. Okay? So, what does that mean? They're using Javen's least favorite style of legal interpretation, right? Oh, the Constitution, it's a living document. We can reinterpret it per our age. Okay? That's what they were doing. And so guess what? You're definitely not going to get a definitive translation of that work. So you're like, why do we regard the Old Testament canon, or Old Testament that we have as our Bibles, as canonical, but not the Mishnah? Here's one of the reasons why. We can't even get you a critical text of it, because it's so fluid. Does that sound like canon to you? No. But even as we're not going to trust it as our canon, what it tells us is that early on, for a long time, they were commenting on what they thought was holy. They weren't trying to add to this, and they regarded it as on a totally different character than the Pentateuch itself. But what it tells us is they thought the Pentateuch was holy and inspired and authoritative. Okay? Here's another term for you, a baraita. And it is, again, an interpretation of the Pentateuch. And a baraita in the Babylonian Talmud reveals composition in the 1st century AD, as does the Megalath Ta'anith in the Mishnah. The Megalath Ta'anith is all of the lesser holidays, or the larger list of holidays for the Jews in the Mishnah. What's the Mishnah? Remember, it's compiled AD 220, and it's a commentary on the Pentateuch. And so you have these two different sets of rabbis. Rabbis from 10 to 220 AD are called the Tanaim, and then from 220 onward are called the Amoraim, so the latter group. And so, but we've got 1st century AD that we're already commenting on the Pentateuch in the Jews, and that we have historical record of. So again, pre-Christian. So there's the Mishnah. The Tosefta is separate from the Mishnah, and it's a commentary on the Mishnah and the Oral Torah. So it's like a commentary on the commentary. Again, we're not going to view that as canonical. It's very fluid. But what does it tell you? It tells you that this first thing, the Pentateuch, that they're commenting on the comments of, they regard as very holy, very important, divine, authoritative. So, Mishnah, Tosefta, and just Midrashim are just all scriptural interpretations. Again, why are we talking about this? Because we're going to refer to Tosefta, Mishnah, Midrash, again in the future, and I want you to know what those terms mean. And what are they? By their definition, they're scriptural interpretations. They think that what they're doing there is they're interpreting Holy Writ. So what does that tell you? There's Holy Writ, pre-Christian. Okay. So if you don't think that the Old Testament is canon, you have to come up with an alternative hypothesis. How did this come about? Why is it viewed as canonical? Why is it viewed as holy? This is basically somebody's conspiracy to foist on you a canon that wasn't really. It's made up. They've just handpicked their favorite things that reflect their worldview, and boom, they're going to drop it on you, and you better believe that it's the Bible, okay? There's your only other option to believe besides the traditional, what we believed, which is that it was obviously canonical, holy, authoritative because of the miracles that attested to it and because of how it was treated. Okay, so now let's take a look at 3 different schools of thought around this time. We talked about a lot of these documents, 2nd century to 1st century AD, and then 1st century BC. So who were the players? Who were the suspects that could have had a role in handcrafting their own canon? Okay? There are 3 schools of thought: Sadducees, Pharisees, and Essenes. Sadducees, Pharisees, and Essenes. Sadducees and Pharisees, you should know from reading the New Testament, okay? And what we find through Josephus is that Jesus and the New Testament authors were smack dab on. They were right on in what they said about the Sadducees and the Pharisees. Their characterization of the Sadducees and Pharisees, guess what? It matches Josephus. It matches other Jewish sources, encouraging us to trust the biblical authority that we have and showing, revealing to us a couple things about this. Does anybody remember some of the things that Jesus says about the Sadducees? Why are they Sadducees? Remember? Why?
Because they didn't believe in the resurrection. That's why they were sad, you see.
Yeah, they didn't believe in the resurrection. And that's not all. But they were the priestly class, the priestly power. The Sanhedrin was a combo leadership team of Sadducees and Pharisees. Jesus says, they know neither the scriptures nor the power of God. And you'll see that revealed in what else we find. The Essenes rejected the priestly ruling class, I think in part because it was redone under the Maccabees, and they put in their own priests. And the Essenes were like, oh, hold up, that's not what the scriptures told us that we could do. We can't just put in our own priesthood here. So they removed themselves, they formed other communities. The Essenes in some ways are not just one thing, there are a few different things. Some of them didn't marry, some of them did marry. We have different communities, not just at Qumran, but also in Alexandria, also in Babylon, I think, too. And some people want to think, oh, there's a Zealot group and there's a Hellenist group. But Beckwith's contention is that no, Zealots, people who wanted the overthrow of Rome, and Hellenists, people who wanted to be very Greek in their philosophy, in their outlook, in their language, they're in all 3 of these communities. Okay, so they're not their own separate school of thought. They're throughout. But these are the main communities: Sadducees, Pharisees, and Essenes. And we're going to talk about what they believe because you're going to see some of this reflected, see some either positive or negative reflected in the literature. Okay, so Sadducees denied the existence of spirits, denied future personal judgment. They're saying You just go to the grave. You just go to Sheol. That's it. They denied future resurrection. So maybe you've heard some of this before. You're like, do Jews really believe in heaven and hell? Well, some of them definitely didn't and have a long history of not. Sometimes you'll meet a Jew and they seem very godless. You're like, why are you... This has a long history. This is a long history of being culturally Jewish and yet it not really having part of your worldview. You'd think, they certainly believe in the metaphysical, and yet you talk to them and you're like, why don't they? This is a long history. No judgment. They deny the existence of angels. Essenes, on the other hand, wanted to name every angel and make sure that they knew the angels by name, and they thought that was some of their power. The Pharisees upheld the oral tradition. Okay, remember we were talking about that. The Mishnah, the received oral tradition. Why wasn't it written down? Oh, well, we wrote it down for you. Do we have a critical edition of it? No, we don't. So it's suspect, but they believed with a lot of the people this oral tradition. Sadducees, not so much. The Essenes had regulations about sacrifices which separated them from the others, in part because they weren't willing to accept this new class of priests. They said, "Whoa, we're not doing that. We're separating from you." So that caused problems. That's going to cause division for them. All three schools differed on the calendar. It's very particular. I'm trying not to get into it. The Essenes stressed divine sovereignty. The Sadducees stressed man's responsibility, and the Pharisees charted a middle course. It's going to be reflected in some of the literature. But basically, to sum up, all these early sources are not Sadducean. They're not foisted upon us by the elitists. The elite who you think, oh, they're running the show, they're pulling the strings, they're telling us what to believe. They definitely didn't decide what was regarded as good books. Because a lot of these early writings are non-Sadducean. Here's how we see it. The following support the existence of angels against the Sadducees: Tobit, Ecclesiasticus, 1st and 3rd books of 1st Enoch. All have angels in them. Ecclesiasticus and 1st Enoch support an afterlife, non-Sadducean. 1st Enoch supports future judgment. 2nd Esdras, the Esther editions, the Wisdom of Solomon, Jeremiah, the three holy children. Don't ask me what that is, but it's another one of these early books. Susanna, Bel and the Dragon, this is the addition to Daniel. Prayer of Manasseh. And 1st through 4 Maccabees all support the existence of angels. What does that tell us? It tells us the Sadducees didn't create this stuff, didn't have this stuff written down and circulated. They were against it. This didn't reflect their worldview. So the idea that the Sadducees created the canon is bonkers. We have them on record as not believing these things. They're not going to formulate the Old Testament canon as it is with the inclusion of all these things. And even the Apocrypha and pseudepigraphal literature show that Sadducees did not have the influence over this. 2nd Esdras, Wisdom of Solomon, and 4 Maccabees support the survival of the human spirit. So you don't just go in the grave and disappear. It's not Sadducean. Baruch supports the existence of demons. He doesn't mention angels, but he does mention fallen. Judith, which is in the Apocrypha, it looks Pharisaic, so non-Sadducean, but here's another reason why we're not including it. It gets its history wrong when it says that Nebuchadnezzar was made king of the Assyrians and invaded Palestine after the exile, not before. We're not going to include that. We're not going to include historically inaccurate books that contradict the biblical canon. Then get this, I'd never realized this before. Some cultures, some of these schools, were looking for two messiahs or a bifold messiah. What biblical book is it where they have the new high priest and the new king? Okay? That's how they were thinking was going to be the Messiah. There was going to be a new high priest Joshua, and the new king Zerubbabel. Oh, what book of the Bible is that? And so the Essenes were looking for this two-person Messiah. But you see in some of this literature a single Messiah, and that is Pharisaic. And the Sadducees just couldn't be bothered. You have this other literature, 1st and 2nd century AD, Parables of Enoch, additions to Enoch, I think it's called, Parables of Enoch, and the Testaments of the 12 Patriarchs. Again, pre-Christian documents. Both works are decidedly non-Christian, but Daniel's Son of Man as Messiah is a main theme in both of these books. So you remember that Jesus referred to himself most frequently as the Son of Man. What's he talking about? Is he saying, I'm just a man, I'm just a son of Adam like you? No. He's referring to the prophecy in Daniel where one like an Ancient of Days gives all authority in heaven on earth to one like a Son of Man. But Jesus, in some ways, wasn't original with that. There were Jews who were looking for the same thing before Christ. They have an ancient character. I don't know exactly what the proof of that is. Probably something that we can see from the Hebrew that they use. But the absence from the parables of any polemic, that means kind of argument, against the Christian identification of the Son of Man and the Chosen One, is hardly explainable in a Jewish work which makes so much of these titles unless it is pre-Christian. So what we're seeing is that the Jews were looking for a one-man Messiah before Jesus. They knew about the Son of Man prophecy. They were looking for it eagerly before Jesus. Partly this is a testament to the inclusion of Daniel early. This is the fan fiction building on what they believe is authoritative, inspired, that the Ancient of Days is going to give authority to one like a Son of Man. And they write about it. We don't consider these Parables of Enoch and 12 Patriarchs authoritative. We're not going to put them in a canon, but they reveal to us the thought of the time, that there was a hope for a single Messiah, one like a Son of Man. Conclusions. Early Jewish literature attests to a pre-Christian canon. Christians didn't create the canon, the Old Testament canon. Early Jewish literature attests to a canon larger than merely the Pentateuch. Remember, Philo refers to the other works of the Old Testament with the same phraseology as he does to the Pentateuch. Later Jewish literature attests to the whole of the Old Testament canon, whilst at the same time revealing itself to be of a vastly different character, aka revisable. Remember Mishnah and the Tosefta, their commentary and comments on the commentary of the oral tradition. And so they reveal to us what they think is important, namely the Pentateuch, whilst at the same time revealing to us we should not regard them as authoritative. Remember, we can't have a critical edition of theirs, even, so fluid. Apocryphal literature, though factually inaccurate, remember like Judith and her take on Nebuchadnezzar, tacitly supports a biblical metaphysic. So they're in the same line as the non-Sadducean Bible. So the Sadducees, in part, got the way they did because they only believed in the Pentateuch. So one of the questions should be, is it only the Pentateuch that's canonical, or is it all of the Old Testament that's canonical? Kind of our question last time was, should the Apocrypha be viewed as canonical? Some of our question this time is, should only the Pentateuch be viewed as canonical? And should we not believe in angels or future judgment Should we basically just believe what the Pentateuch tells us? This is kind of, in some ways, like Jewish fundamentalism. Take me back to the fundamentals, just the Pentateuch. But that actually shows itself to not be truly Hebrew, to be cutting off things that God authoritatively said, verified with other miracles. And finally, we see that the elite ruling class, the Sadducees, could not have been responsible for crafting the Old Testament canon as it exists. This isn't foisted upon you. This isn't a snow job to get you to believe this because we say so. The rulers didn't believe what was in the canon. So if you're going to tell me that, they handcrafted it, the powers that be handcrafted it and foisted it on people, that doesn't hold up to historical criticism. All right, any questions or comments? Yes, Nancy.
Of the three groups, the Sadducees, Pharisees, and Essenes, which one would you say held to the Old Testament scriptures as being true? Or is there
Which Old Testament scriptures?
Yeah.
Okay, right?
I'm saying the Hebrew canon
That we have.
that existed when Christ was
Pharisees and Essenes regarded the rest of the scripture, the tripartite Old Testament, whereas the Sadducees seemed to only regard the Pentateuch.
That's what I've always
So
thought, but I
in some ways we would identify more with the Essenes and the Pharisees. It's just a question of how hardcore a Jew would you have been, okay? And I mark you as kind of in the Essene camp, Nancy, okay? When they try to foist a new priesthood on you, you're going to say, I'm not really buying it. But the Pharisees are like, man, the people really want it, though. Let's give them what they want. They want priesthood. They want sacrifices. Let's just make it happen. Any other comments or questions? Yeah, Dan.
Is a future class going to look at the New Testament reference to the Old Testament?
Yes, definitely. Let's see, when are we getting to that? Yeah, next class. We'll look at the structure of the canon, evidence from Ecclesiasticus, evidence from the Gospels, evidence from Philo, Josephus, Jerome, Talmud. So we're gonna dive deeper. I just wanted to get you familiar with some of these terms. I mean, I had to have my dictionary close by. Talmud, Mishnah. I had to figure this stuff out. So, all right. Anything else? There's a lot more. We'll get to it in good time. Let's pray.